Hello everyone, my name is Alex and I want to welcome you to our talk on the soundness of infrastructure adversaries. This project is joint work with Robert Künnemann, and we are both researchers at the CISP by Helmholtz Center for Information Security. So let's start. Protocol designers and researchers develop and improve many different security protocols for a huge variety of applications. And it is not only the number of different security protocols which is quite high, but also the number of the different guarantees they promise. For users wanting to ensure security of the infrastructure, it is not easy to see what protocols are needed and what the best choices would be. To help with this decision, Speicher et al. Proposed a methodology to assess deployments of protocols in IT infrastructures, based on AI planning. In their methodology, among other things, they perform a quantitative risk assessment in the infrastructure model. We will come to that later. With this kind of assessment, we can try to answer questions like, does deployment of DNSSEC improve the overall security in the infrastructure? And if yes, to what degree? Or what is the most economically efficient deployment strategy of protocols to improve the security of an infrastructure? Answers to these questions can help network administrators to plan their investments for security deployments. Policymakers and standardization bodies can use it to evaluate policies and plan where their future efforts should be focused. And for protocol designers and researchers, such an assessment could help to identify problems with the status quo and lead to future research efforts. With that being said, we now come back to the infrastructure model. As mentioned before, we use this model to perform quantitative security risk assessment of networks or IT infrastructures. In contrast to other models of risk assessment techniques, here we have a rule-based threat model that builds on security protocol guarantees. We call the threat model the infrastructure adversary. While the techniques for the quantitative analysis in this infrastructure model are formal and well justified, the rules of the infrastructure adversary are not. It is neither safe to assume that the set of rules is comprehensive, nor that it is correct. In this work, we propose a methodology to gain more trust towards the infrastructure adversary, and therefore more trust towards analysis in the infrastructure model. We achieve this gain of trust by building on an already established concept, namely the symbolic model of cryptography. The symbolic model is used to analyze various properties of security protocols and cryptographic constructions. Its attacker model, the Dolev-Yao model, is a rule-based, well-studied threat model. It uses abstracted models of cryptographic primitives, like symmetric encryption or digital signatures, as its base building blocks. The symbolic model of cryptography is established in the community and has a huge selection of tools to help with automation, like ProVerif, Temurin, or DeepSec. As the rules of the infrastructure adversary are based on properties of security protocols, the symbolic model, which is used to prove those properties, can be used as a tool to justify the infrastructure adversary rules. We hence define the notion of symbolic soundness, connecting those two models, lifting guarantees of the symbolic model to the infrastructure model. In the remaining part of this talk, I will first get into more detail on how we define symbolic soundness. As a next step, we will have a look at how we prove this property for a given model. After that, we will take a look at the symbolic model, and eventually I will conclude the presentation with a summary of our results. What is symbolic soundness? The general idea is that, for any attack we find in the symbolic model, this attack is also counted in the quantitative analysis by the infrastructure model. Or in other words, the infrastructure's adversary's capabilities are comprehensive. So getting more precise, we want to relate the infrastructure adversary model to the Dolev-Yao model. So first we need to formalize those models. For the infrastructure adversary, we use TRIPS, an established and widely spread planning formalism. On the symbolic side, we use a dialect of the pi calculus, used by the protocol verification tool ProVerif. We define symbolic soundness over the traces of both models during the execution. Hence, our approach applies only to security properties that can be expressed as trace properties. Now let's get to the definition. For an infrastructure adversary model M and the symbolic process P, symbolic soundness is defined as follows. For all traces produced by executing P, there exists a planning trace by executing M, such that both traces are equal. We will not get deeper into that notion of planning trace or equality here, but all the details can be found in our paper. Let's take a look at the problem of checking symbolic soundness for two models. To prove that an infrastructure adversary model M is symbolically sound with respect to a symbolic process P, we identified a set of conditions. Two of those conditions depend on the formalisms used. For the formalism chosen in our work, these conditions hold in general for any instance of M and P. Two other conditions are requirements on the infrastructure adversary model, which can be checked syntactically for any concrete model M. All these conditions can be met without putting too many restrictions on both models. The last condition requires checking certain properties in the process P. So knowing all that, when looking at case studies, we would have a concrete instance of some infrastructure adversary model M. So to check that all conditions hold, we need to construct a corresponding process P to check that. We will now get into more detail on how to construct P. To create any infrastructure model M, we need a description of the infrastructure we want to analyze. To get P, we also used this infrastructure description given as a graph G. We then constructed a function f, given the set of protocols in the graph G, that produces a process P. Note that f is fixed for the set of protocols used in M. Hence, we do not give a generalized function f, but demonstrate the methodology of constructing f using a case study instead. But back to process P. Whereas P would suffice to analyze symbolic soundness, P also has major practical drawbacks. First, P is fixed or hard-coded for concrete graph G. That means that one small change in the infrastructure, like adding a server, would invalidate the analysis as G changed. Second, infrastructures can become very large, and therefore in practice the graph G can have millions of nodes. This would cause problems, and as protocol verifiers do not scale well with the model size. To deal with these problems, we introduced two nice process transformations. Both transformations are independent of f or g, and hence not fixed for some specific case study or model. Simply speaking, the first transformation permits substituting several uniform, parallel processes by a single process under replication that obtains its input from the adversary instead of gaining the information by the fixed graph G. With this, the process becomes independent of G. After this first transformation, we now could conduct verification with any suited verification tool. However, to improve verification, we constructed a second process transformation, which has a more technical nature. As we have chosen ProVerif as our tool of choice, the transformation's purpose is to help ProVerif's verification algorithm. For both transformations, we have proven that the set of traces of the resulting processes are equal or a superset of the traces of the original processes. Hence, by proving symbolic soundness between infrastructure model and process, P', we automatically can infer the symbolic soundness between M and any P independent of the graph G. With this, we can prove symbolic soundness for a fixed infrastructure adversary, but independent of the concrete IT infrastructure. So, let us take a look at our results. At first, we defined a notion named symbolic soundness, connecting the infrastructure and the symbolic layer. We came up with a list of conditions under which this notion can be proven for some pair of corresponding models. We further gave a transformation to safely construct a process in the PyCalculus from a given infrastructure description. Since this process would be hard-coded for the infrastructure, we have constructed and proven two sound process transformations, leading to a more general process. As a next step, we conducted a case study of a recent work by Speicher et al. To demonstrate the applicability of our mechanisms. In their work, the authors assessed protocol deployment for email infrastructures on a global scale. Using our priorly presented methodology, we could detect flaws in the threat model and propose possible fixes. Additionally, we did not only investigate soundness, but completeness as well. We used a similar methodology to define the notion of symbolic completeness. However, we could identify that a major condition needed to prove completeness for a pair of models is in fact a liveness property. As verification of liveness properties is not supported by current security protocol verification tools, we could not conduct any case study on our symbolic completeness notion. And with that, I will now conclude our talk. If you're interested in the details of our work, please read our paper on the soundness of infrastructure adversaries. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the upcoming Q&A session. Thank you for your attention.